And in that moment, the feeling of fear and agony merged with one of immense relief and happiness. And from this point on, Dostoevsky believed that one cannot exist without the other, that in order to feel true happiness, one needs to suffer first. With some authors, it doesn't really matter that much to know their biography. It could be interesting to find some nuggets of their own lives that they put into their stories. And then there are authors that pour everything they are into their writing. In my opinion, to understand Dostoevsky and his writing, you need to know a little bit about him. I will tell you as much as I can factually, just to get you started. Fyodor Dostoevsky was born 30th of October 1821 in a noble family, but not a particularly rich one. His father was working as a doctor, and he was not particularly affectionate person. He was strict, he was prone to fits of anger and jealousy. His mother, a nice, quiet, tender woman, she passed away from a long illness when Dostoevsky was 16 years old. Dostoevsky was at her side throughout her illness. Biographers imply that this feeling of pity and love for his mother then translated into his relationships with women, specifically can be seen with his first wife. But weirdly, he was just as distraught by Pushkin's passing, which happened around the same time. He said to his brother that had he not been in mourning for his mother, he would have been for Pushkin. His father was sad, but his wife's dying also allowed him to spiral out of control. In the end, he sent his daughters to aunties and the boys to an engineering college. Father installed himself in his poor village of Daravoye. He started drinking heavily. He took up a peasant girl as his lover. She even gave birth to his child. But as time went on, Mikhail became more and more obnoxious. He was incredibly violent with his peasant serfs, and that provoked more than displeasure from them. He died on the way from one village to another sometime in 1839. The official cause of death was a stroke. Unofficially, his peasant men just straight up killed him. The horrible image of the father in Brothers Karamazov is said to have been at least partially inspired by Mikhail Dostoevsky. If you're curious, you can check out Freud's paper on Dostoevsky and Brothers Karamazov. There he explores the Oedipus complex and patricide as it relates to Dostoevsky. I'm personally not a particularly great fan of Freud, but it can be potentially interesting for you. Fyodor at the time was in college, but he didn't care much for what was taught there. Engineering didn't agree with him. He wanted to write. His first novel, Poor Folk, found almost instant success. Legend has it that Nekrasov was so impressed by it that he rushed to critic Belinsky's home in the middle of the night. Belinsky, who was a huge deal at the time, was also appropriately impressed and highly praised the novel, and that allowed Dostoevsky entry into the most prestigious literary circle of the time, the Belinsky Group or the Severmanic Magazine Group. This proved fraught with issues, however, because this almost instant fame went straight to his head. He was arrogant and brash, but combative and sensitive at the same time, and that group didn't particularly like his arrogance, but also they had their own sense of humor, so they liked to poke and kind of provoke Dostoevsky into arguments and make fun of him. For example, Nekrasov and Turgenev wrote a satirical pamphlet about Dostoevsky that hurt him quite a bit, and that was actually the last straw for him, and he left that group. And that pushed him straight into the waiting arms of Petrashevsky group. Petrashevsky was a weird chap. He had ideas, many of them, but most importantly, he was a great follower of Fourier and Fourier's ideas of socialism. Petrashevsky even tried to implement Fourier's ideas of communal living in his village up Russian north, that is until his peasant men burned that felon's tear down. And Petrashevsky had this group of like-minded individuals, and they met weekly to discuss stuff. They were reading forbidden literature, and that was enough to put them on Tsar's police radar. Nikolai I was ruthless and deathly afraid of revolution spreading into Russia, and squashed any and all attempts at independent thought. The assessment of Petrashevsky's group as true revolutionaries is debatable. Yes, they were utopian socialists, but it looks like they were more talk than bite. Another thing to keep in mind is that young Dostoevsky is not the one that we know from his later work. This young Dostoevsky is taken by liberal thought. He's a romantic. Take a look at his short story White Knight. His break from Belinsky and Belinsky's group is not only dictated by his hurt ego, but also by Belinsky's shift to radical realism in writing, while Dostoevsky believed in art for art's sake. Politically, he believed in this utopian socialism, and he was much less interested in religion. And in Petrashevsky group, he found those people who were a little bit more liberal and more atheistic than was allowed at the time. During one of the evenings, Dostoevsky read a letter from Belinsky to Gogol during that period of time when Gogol got into his preachy period of his life and writing and was waxing poetics about Christianity and its role in turning Russia into a more prosperous state. And Belinsky was pushing back a little bit and pleading for a more secular approach for Gogol and his writing. One more thing to remember, that the Russian absolutism of the time, the so-called Tsarist autocracy, also included the control of the monarch of the Russian Orthodox Church. Not only was he the head of state, but he was also put there by God, and thus any inkling of atheism or downplaying the role of the Russian Christian Church was going against the monarch, and Nikolai took it personally. One night, the police showed up to all of the Petrashevsky group. They were all arrested and brought to Petropavlovsky fortress to await their sentence. They've spent multiple months in prison under trial until one day, 22nd of December 1849, they were brought to the Semyonovsky Platz, where the sentence was read out to them. And the sentence was death.
Retired engineer lieutenant Fyodor Dostoevsky, 27 years old, for participating in criminal schemes, for distributing a private letter filled with impudent expressions against the Orthodox Church and the supreme power, and for attempting to distribute through the home lithography works against the government, is sentenced to death by firing squad.
They were put into robes, the priests took their last confessions, they were separated into groups of 3, and the first 3 were brought to scaffold, bugs over their heads, awaiting the gunshot. Dostoevsky was standing in the second throuple. Immediately, several soldiers went up to Petrashevsky, especially from Mambeli, took them by their hands and led them off the scaffold. They led them to the great pillars and began to tie each to a separate pillar with ropes. There was no conversation. The convicts did not resist. Their arms were tied behind the posts and then ropes were tied with a belt. Then their order was given. Put the caps over their eyes. After which the caps were lowered over the faces of our bound comrades. The command rang out. And then a group of soldiers, there were about 16 of them, standing at the very scaffold, on command, pointed their guns at Petrashevsky, especially from Mambeli. This moment was truly terrible. To see preparations for the shooting, and moreover people close in friendly relations, to see rifle barrels already pointed at them, almost point blank, and expect blood would be spilled, and they would fall dead. It was terrible, disgusting, scary. But the gunshots never went off. Nikolai I decided to teach them one last lesson. Another courier rushed in rather theatrically with their actual sentence, which for Dostoevsky was 4 years in a hard labor prison camp in Siberia and then military service as a soldier. And obviously such an experience makes a lasting impression. One of the men who was in that first 3, he actually went mad. Dostoevsky, as he was standing there, he cried out, "In a moment we're all going to be with God." Dostoevsky said to Streshnev, "Nous serons avec le Christ." Un peu de poussière, he responded. This was a turning point for Dostoevsky's life, for his beliefs, like his attitudes towards religion, but also biographers imply, and I tend to agree, that in that moment this feeling of great fear and agony merged with the feeling of relief and happiness, and from this point on Dostoevsky believed that one cannot exist without the other, that in order to feel true happiness one needs to suffer first. You will see this motive in quite a few of Dostoevsky's works, for example in Crime and Punishment, where Raskolnikov believes that he first needs to serve his penance before he would be worthy of his happiness. This scene of fake execution is described in great detail in The Idiot, Prince Myshkin tells the story a couple of times, and that actually highlights Dostoevsky's own beliefs in terms of death penalty. And off they went to Siberia. On one of the stops in Tobolsk, they ran into decabrist wives who gave them advice on how to survive what awaited them, and one of them gave Dostoevsky her copy of the Bible. That probably also solidified the suffering and reward duo in Dostoevsky's mind, because Russian Orthodox Church is very much based on it. This copy of the Bible was the only book that Dostoevsky was allowed to have for 4 years in a prison camp near Omsk, and he studied it religiously. He kept it all his life, and it is now in one of the museums, and it's completely covered with notes from Dostoevsky. And the prison camp had rather torturous conditions: hard labor camp in the middle of Siberian winters, shackles around their ankles for the entirety of the sentence. This was not a political camp, so Dostoevsky was surrounded by creme de la creme of the Russian criminal underworld, murderers, rapists, thieves, and such. And all of these mostly peasant criminals didn't particularly care for a nobleman being amongst them. On a smaller scale, that's Raskolnikov's experience in the epilogue of The Crime and Punishment, his otherness amongst other criminals. For this part of life, check out the notes from The Dead House. It is very much based on Dostoevsky's experience in the prison camp and the stories from his prison mates. Dostoevsky was released from prison, but what awaited him was only marginally better: soldier duty in the middle of nowhere with a ban from returning to Russia for the duration of the duty. He got stationed in Semipalatinsk, current-day Simi, Kazakhstan, a small town in the middle of nowhere occupied mostly by the military and a few locals. Dostoevsky craved for a better company than the peasant criminals he'd spent 4 years of his life with, but Semipalatinsk didn't have very much to offer in that regard. The only educated person there was a woman, Maria Dmitrievna, a wife of a customs officer, Alexander Isayev. Isayev himself was an intellectual at one point, but his drinking problem took that rather away from him, so the family life was not particularly happy. It was not he who attracted me to him, but his wife, Maria Dmitrievna. This is a lady, still young, 28 years old, pretty, very educated, very smart, kind, sweet, graceful, with an excellent, generous heart. She endures her fate proudly, obediently. She plays the role of a maid herself. She cares for her careless husband, to whom, by right of friendship, I gave a lot of guidance, as to her son. She just became ill, impressionable, and irritable. Her character, however, was cheerful and frisky. I hardly left their house. What happy evenings I spent in her company. I have rarely met such a woman. Maria Dmitrievna, still a young woman, most likely also craved for a better company, and so she hired Dostoevsky first as a tutor for her son Pavel, and then a relationship blossomed between her and Dostoevsky. Dostoevsky fell hard. Was it because she was literally the first woman he'd seen in 5 years? Did she captivate him with something else? We don't know. But they were completely taken by one another, and since this relationship was a secret one and an affair, one can assume that they were likely waiting for Isayev to drink himself to death. That didn't happen. Instead, Isayev got transferred to Kuznetsk and obviously took his wife and child with him. Dostoevsky was devastated. When saying goodbye, he wept like a child. He'd written her long letters for months, until about 6 months later a note came from Maria notifying him of her husband's death. Dostoevsky snuck out of Semipalatinsk and went to Kuznetsk in order to propose to Maria, but she was not as eager. In Kuznetsk, she met a young teacher called Virgunov, and she'd started an affair with him. On top of that, her husband left her in a rather precarious financial state, and Dostoevsky didn't have much to offer her, really. He was a soldier and bound to that duty. Dostoevsky returned to Semipalatinsk, likely sad, angry, and jealous, but also not willing to give up. He pulled all of the strings that he could and actually got himself a promotion to an officer, and that alleviated some of Maria's concerns, and she agreed to marry him. In the fall of 1856, the couple got married in Kuznetsk. Her ex-lover Virgunov was part of the bridal party, but the couple needed to return to Semipalatinsk. One of the turning points in their relationship happened almost instantly. Dostoevsky, who suffered from epilepsy throughout his life, had an epileptic seizure, if not directly on their wedding night, but at least soon after the wedding, and that scared Maria a lot. It looks like it also happened in the context of their sexual relationship, so that rather put a damper on that party. But Maria was now very much worried that Dostoevsky is going to die and leave her just like her husband's done before, and that became a rather obsessive thought. The relationship was never the same afterwards and got progressively worse. Maria hated Semipalatinsk and the society there and seemingly nagged Dostoevsky about it. Dostoevsky wasn't particularly happy either, and as fate had it, there was a chance to get out of there. Nikolai I, the Tsar who condemned Dostoevsky to this fate, he passed away in 1855, and his successor Alexander II was more reasonable. 1857, Dostoevsky got back his status of hereditary nobleman, and 1859 a pardon was issued that allowed for Dostoevsky's return to European part of Russia, but he was still banned from returning to either Moscow or St. Petersburg. Dostoevskys installed themselves in Tver, a town right on the road between the two capitals. In Tver, the relationship between Fyodor and Maria finally fell apart. Maria was a complicated woman, but also a very sickly one. We don't really know what happened. Biographers imply that either all of their relationship problems are accumulated enough, some imply that she still loved that Verganov chap, we don't know. But when Dostoevsky was finally allowed to return to St. Petersburg, she didn't go with him, and from that point on, the couple never lived together. Maria got diagnosed with tuberculosis sometime in the early 1860s, and she'd suffer from it for the rest of her life until she passed away in 1864. Her image you can see in a lot of Dostoevsky's work. For example, her husband and her are the prototypes for the Marmelada family in Crime and Punishment. The love triangle of Dostoevsky, Maria, Virgunov is also present in Humiliated and Insulted. And in general, if you see a sickly woman in Dostoevsky's work, she's likely inspired either by Maria or Dostoevsky's mother, also called Maria. You'll notice that he describes them with tender pity. He loves them and feels sorry for them. Because in the end, that's how Dostoevsky describes Maria. She loved me immensely and I loved her without measure, but we were not happy together. She is the purest, the noblest, the most generous woman out of all I've known in life. But while his marriage was falling apart, other parts of Dostoevsky's life were doing better. It took him a few years to get into the rhythm of writing, but none of the things that he's written garnered much success. He needed a comeback, a piece that's gonna prop him into the public eye like the poor folk had done for him in his youth. The House of the Dead, first published 1861, became that for him. The fictional yet still raw depiction of the prison life and the prison mates of Dostoevsky made him, at least according to Gertsen, into a Russian Dante depicting the descent into hell. Dostoevsky, along with his brother Mikhail, published a magazine called Время, and once that got shut down, Epocha. In this magazine, Dostoevsky published his first works, the aforementioned The House of the Dead, Notes from the Underworld, Humiliated and Insulted, amongst others. And while money was still an issue, he was once again known as the great Russian author. And that's how he met Apollinaria Suslova. Apollinaria was a young 23-year-old woman, strong and beautiful, free-minded and passionate. They say that she was the one to seek Dostoevsky out, attracted to his mind and authorial greatness. Because really, what else is there? He's not a looker, he was sickly, in addition to his epilepsy. Prison had a real toll on his health, and he was always in debt. But I don't know, somehow they started an affair. It looks like he was her first lover and out of wedlock, so that wasn't ideal. Dostoevsky was once again swept off his feet. He pursued her, and she reciprocated, but at the same time she was not happy being his mistress, because Dostoevsky was still very much married to his sickly Maria. So at one point he offered her to come with him to Europe, Dostoevsky to improve his health and to simply travel a little bit, and in Europe they wouldn't have to hide as much. She agreed, but they were still fighting, so when life got in the way and Dostoevsky had to stay in St. Petersburg a couple of extra weeks to settle some financial issues, Apollinaria went to Paris without him, and it looks like she was running away from him. When Dostoevsky arrived in Paris, he found out that Apollinaria has already had an affair with the Spaniard Salvador, and he already had time to dump her. But this very brief affair has cooled Apollinaria's affections toward Dostoevsky right down. Dostoevsky was once again devastated. He tried to console her because she was very much hurt and insulted by Salvador's treatment of her and his betrayal. But then Dostoevsky still offered for her to travel with him as brother and sister. Now, I'm stepping on shaky grounds here. All the biographies that you read, you will see that this relationship was described as them hurting one another, tormenting one another, a love-hate thing. He called her an infernal woman. And this puts a lot of blame on her for torturing our poor Dostoevsky by denying him her affections. But the problem is that I have read extracts from her diary from that trip to Europe, and it's not that clear-cut. Dostoevsky comes off as predatory. He's much older than her. He's in position of power. There is a rather nasty scene in a hotel room where he's leering at her and refusing to leave her alone in the night. It's all weird. So potentially all of this torturing that she's done to him might have been self-inflicted. Remember the point I made about pain and pleasure being tied together for him? So maybe that's what it was. Chasing a woman who does not want you but whom you desire with great passion might have been pleasurable for him. And also, while in Europe, Dostoevsky indulged in another vice of his, gambling. He used to play roulette religiously, losing every penny that he had, pawning his stuff, pawning Apollinaria's stuff. And that's probably one of the reasons why Apollinaria left him in the end, because she saw the addict there and she didn't want to have anything with him anymore. Both of these plot lines are present in The Gambler, both Dostoevsky's gambling addiction and his perception of Apollinaria, who became femme fatale Polina Alexandrovna. But even without the gambling addiction, Dostoevsky has always struggled with money. He was rather irresponsible with it to begin with, but his financial responsibilities grew with time. He had to take care of himself, his wife, his stepson. Once his beloved brother Mikhail had passed away, he took care of his wife and her children, and his mistress and her child. The two magazines that the brothers published also accumulated a lot of debt. As a result, Dostoevsky became one of the first professional writers, that meaning that he relied on his craft for income. That was a source of a lot of jealousy from Dostoevsky towards writers like Turgenev and Tolstoy, who had other sources of income and thus could write when inspiration struck and make as many changes and revisions as they wanted, while Dostoevsky always rushed to get the piece out as soon as he possibly could to get the payment for it. But also because all of St. Petersburg knew of Dostoevsky's financial situation, he was the most underpaid writer of that time. His remuneration was much lower than Turgenev's or Tolstoy's. All that forced Dostoevsky into a rather unfortunate deal with a publisher called Stilovsky. Stilovsky made a big advance payment on a novel, and that allowed Dostoevsky to pay off some urgent debt, but the terms of the deal were that Dostoevsky was supposed to deliver a full novel to Stilovsky in a year's time by November 1st, 1866. Dostoevsky spent most of 1866 writing The Crime and Punishment for a different publisher, so by October of that year he was rather in a bind. If he failed to produce a novel in a month's time, Stilovsky would get rights to publish all of Dostoevsky's works for free for the next 9 years. Dostoevsky was desperate, and friends suggested that he hire an assistant, a stenographer, so Dostoevsky could dictate to her, and that was supposed to help get the novel out quickly. He hired Anna Snitkina, to whom he confessed the dire situation that he found himself in. Anna, who was a huge fan of his, reassured him that they'd manage. They got The Gambler done in under a month, in 26 days. Stilovsky, who was not a particularly nice fellow, he skipped town on the last day of the bet, so Dostoevsky couldn't fulfill his side of the bargain. Dostoevsky acted smart for once, and he left the manuscript at the police station so that they could confirm that he'd fulfilled his side of the bargain. There is also some evidence that Stilovsky fabricated the entire situation that led Dostoevsky to him. He was behind those creditors that were demanding money urgently from Dostoevsky. But regardless, that's the story of the novel Gambler. As a side note, some speculate that that's why the epilogue of The Crime and Punishment is what it is, because he had to rush it in order to get to The Gambler. On a personal note, after all this ordeal, the 45-year-old Dostoevsky invited the 20-year-old Anna back in, and in a roundabout way proposed to her. Is it possible that a young girl, so different in character and age, could fall in love with my artist? Wouldn't that be psychological infidelity? That's what I'd like to know your opinion about, Anna Grigorievna. Put yourself in her shoes for a moment, he said. Imagine that this artist is me, that I confessed my love to you and asked you to be my wife. Tell me, what would you say to me? Fyodor Mikhailov's face expressed such embarrassment, such heartache, that I finally realized that this was not just a literary conversation, and that I would deal a terrible blow to his self-esteem and pride if I gave an evasive answer. I looked at the worried face of Fyodor Mikhailovich, so dear to me, and said, I would tell you that I love you, and I will love you all my life. She agreed, and on 15th of February 1857 she became his second wife. In order for them to go away to Europe and pay off some urgent debt, she had to pawn off her entire dowry that she never got back. The couple spent about 4 years in Europe. It was cheaper for them to live there. Unfortunately, Dostoevsky was still gambling, sometimes losing it all, pawning all of their stuff away, including Anna's clothes, for example. Thus, their life in Europe was not sunshine and rainbows. On top of their financial problems, their first child, Sofia, died as an infant 1868, and that was a huge blow to Dostoevsky. The turning point was 1871, when Dostoevsky, seemingly out of nowhere, quit the roulette and never returned to it. By some accounts, his father came to him in a dream, and after that, Dostoevsky was cured of his addiction. The family returned to St. Petersburg that year, and thus began the most prosperous period of life for Dostoevsky. Anna took over managing their finances, but she also started publishing her husband's works herself, and that allowed for more income. They still only managed to pay off all of their debts a year before Dostoevsky's death. Anecdotally, Dostoevsky was still terrible with money. A story has it that once he received a payment for one of the novels, a huge amount of money, and he thought, what should I do? My wife, she's an angel, she's doing so much for me, I should do something nice for her. So he went and bought an expensive bracelet for most of the payment that he'd received. He came back to her all proud and presented it to her, and she was like, okay, thank you, I appreciate the sentiment, but maybe we should return it because our children really need some new shoes and there are other payments that need to happen. I think they kept the bracelet and found money for shoes somewhere else, but that kind of shows you where Dostoevsky was with money. But with Anna managing the finances and the publishing, that finally allowed Dostoevsky space to write. This is the time of the famous great Pentateuch, The Crime and Punishment, The Idiot, Demons, The Adolescent, and The Brothers Karamazov. That last novel is considered to be the pinnacle of all of his writing that accumulated all of his ideas and beliefs. From political perspective, Dostoevsky has moved far away from the ideas of his youth. The utopian socialism that he called theoretical was completely gone upon his exit from prison. What took place were extremely conservative beliefs that were ironically Nikolai I's ideas, the very Tsar that put Dostoevsky in prison. It does check out. If Dostoevsky believed himself worthy of the punishment for his sins, then he probably would have supported Nikolai in his decision to punish him. That probably was not his mindset in the beginning of his incarceration, but he might have gotten there. Dostoevsky's brand of conservatism is based on Nikolai I's slogan, orthodoxy, autocracy, nationality. That actually nicely sums up the three pillars of Dostoevsky's belief system. He was incredibly religious, he was a monarchist, and a Slavophile. The first two are somewhat obvious and straightforward, the last one is less so. Dostoevsky never called himself a Slavophile. He, along with his brother and some of the friends, have developed their own movement called Почвенничество. Their idea was the Russian people's mission in life was to save all of the mankind. They preached for closer ties of intellectuals with the people. They spoke of industrialization and civil liberties, but at the same time condemned the West for its bourgeoisness and lack of spirituality. You will see a lot of it in Dostoevsky's work, and that put him rather at odds with the more liberally minded of his generation. Demons caused an outrage as it was kind of obviously anti-nihilist and anti-revolutionary Democrats. Another thing that might help you understand Dostoevsky is his views on love. There are different types of love for Dostoevsky. The love for God that stands above all else, and then there is friendly love, paternal love, and passion. You will see that all of his characters are striving towards the first one as the epitome of all things virtuous, while his morally reprehensible characters are succumbing to passion, which is always coded negatively. Some researchers imply that it is tied to Dostoevsky's own relationship with romantic love and sexuality. One can infer a lot here, but it's mostly speculation, so I cannot present you with many facts here. Just keep in mind that Dostoevsky, more than any other writer, relied on personal experience when crafting his characters, so his perceptions of love, they bleed into his characters. Look at the infernal Polina in The Gambler, the saint and the sinner in the relationship of Raskolnikov and Sonia, the fallen woman and the savior in The Idiot. These archetypes, they persist, and they are the reflection of Dostoevsky's own relationship with women. And obviously Christianity is ever present in Dostoevsky's work. His characters are always searching for meaning, and they find it in religion. The somewhat pretentious reading of Crime and Punishment is that it is a detective story, and while in a traditional detective story the characters are looking for the culprit, in Crime and Punishment they are looking for God. Dostoevsky pulls no punches in portraying and coding his characters as good and bad. They may be complex with deep internal struggles, but you can always see the characters that Dostoevsky likes or at least approves of. They are all sinners, the scum of the earth, but some of them get the chance at redemption, but some will not. Some will die sinners, but some will find absolution in God and get the second chance, just like Dostoevsky did. But their only way is through God. But how did Dostoevsky's story end? Dostoevsky was sick. Epilepsy that he suffered from throughout his life was progressing. Some say that the final blow came when his sister came to see him in early 1881. She came demanding money for her and her now adult children, while Dostoevsky had small children to take care of, and that provoked a heated argument that could have escalated the progression of his disease. In a weird twist of fate, a man who gave money freely, to family or otherwise, fell deathly ill the first time he'd refused. In a few days' time, January 28th, 1881, Dostoevsky passed away from tuberculosis, bronchitis, and emphysema. All of St. Petersburg came to pay their respects to the fallen author. Dostoevsky's legacy and influence on the Russian literature cannot be underplayed. Abroad, he is the most well-known Russian author. Here, the opinion on him is rather split. You rarely meet a person who's just meh on Dostoevsky. You either love him or hate him. I am personally a proud hater of Dostoevsky. In the Venn diagram of my beliefs and his beliefs, these circles, they just don't meet. And on top of that, I don't particularly enjoy his style of writing, so enjoying his work, even based on that, is impossible for me. So it is highly unlikely that I'm going to review his books on this channel. But I've chosen to do this video instead because I think knowing his story helps understand his writing, even if it doesn't help me enjoy it anymore. So hopefully I've managed to highlight the major points of his biography, and if you want to learn more, there are countless papers and books written on Dostoevsky and his writing, so if you are curious about that, you can always check out more.